In 1983, I completed my studies at UC Davis and embarked on a winemaking career, which culminated 30 years later in the publication of Postmodern Winemaking, rethinking the modern science of an ancient craft. And in those 30 years, I had come to a different understanding of what wine is than I had been taught in school. And so you can think of this book as a discussion of what I learned during that period that added to and to a certain extent altered my thinking about what wine is and how it ought to be made. And I defined postmodern winemaking as the practical art of connecting the human soul to the soul of a place by rendering its grapes into liquid music. The first chapter of that book I had actually written years earlier as part of my column in Wines and Vines called Postmodern Winemaking, and it was entitled The Solution Problem, Overcoming Enology. So a lot of what I came to understand is based on this idea that wine is not a chemical solution, and that the belief that it is leads us to a lot of errors and holds us back as winemakers from making great wine. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this section. So let's ask ourselves the question, what is wine anyway? Well, Robert Louis Stevenson said wine is bottled poetry. I used to think that that was kind of over the top. This is on a billboard that I first saw in 1972 visiting the Napa Valley. And, geez, I like wine, but I don't know about bottled poetry. Well, I have since come to understand and learn how to make the kind of wines that I think Stevenson was talking about. And I did it through moving away from modern wine chemistry and towards this postmodern wine chemistry methodology that I'm going to talk about. So I coined this term liquid music to express what I was talking about. Art Buchwald said it puckers your mouth. This is Thomas Jefferson. No nation is drunken where wine is cheap. This is the European idea that it's an expression of place. A lot of religions include wine as part of their sacraments, and it's regarded as the blood of Christ, for example. I really like this one. Galileo called it sunshine held together by water. Susan B. Anthony called it a fate worse than death. Louis Pasteur called it the most gentle and efficacious of medicines. Archimedes called it wisdom and wit to the wise, and the one that I really like the best and that I try to hold myself to, I never want to bottle anything unless it passes the test of Franklin's proof. And Ben Franklin said that wine is proof that God loves us and desires us to be happy. I just got through reading Hugh Johnson's The Story of Wine. I really recommend it to anyone. It's such a great trek through the history of wine from the ancients to the present day. And right in the beginning of the book, Hugh says, the polite definition of wine is the naturally fermented juice of fresh grapes. Then he goes on to say, a more clinical one is an aqueous solution of ethanol with greater or lesser traces of sugars, acids, esters, acetates, lactates, and other substances occurring in grape juice or derived from it by fermentation. Well, right the first time, Hugh, but I am sorry. It turns out that wine is not an aqueous solution, at least not great red wine. And the belief that it is gets us into all kinds of trouble. So I'm going to get into some detail about what I'm talking about here. So with ideal solution behavior, we have a glass of wine that does not have any structure. It's just, as Hugh Johnson says, a bunch of chemicals dissolved in an aqueous solution containing ethanol. So we'll call this unstructured wine, and we're going to have various aromas dissolved in that wine, and they'll have various volatilities. So it's a polar solution, for example, the apolar stuff, the esters, for example, or the terpenes that are apolar don't dissolve very well, and they're going to have a volatility. We'll push them into the gas phase. Other compounds that have an affinity for wine will be less volatile, but everybody's going to have an equilibrium. It's going to push up into the gas phase where we can smell the aroma, and then there'll be an equilibrium proportional to the volatility constant according to Henry's law. That's what ideal solution behavior looks like, and the implications for winemaking are that we manage aromatics by controlling the composition of the wine. For example, if we want more fruit and less veg, we have to take some action to manage the composition. So, for example, we farm for flavors. We work the canopy in such a way as to expose the fruit, minimizing pyrazines and maximizing the fruity aromatics and anything else that we may want, such as color. Then we're going to want to do selective extraction, very gentle crushing, gentle cap management, gentle pressing. And the whole idea is to selectively extract color and flavor while minimizing the harsh tannins. We're going to keep the harsh tannins out of the wine to the extent that we can. We're going to increase the extraction of color by using high alcohol as a solvent. Then we're going to prevent oxidation by reductive winemaking practices. We're going to keep air away from that wine at every stage to preserve its freshness and its fruit and to avoid oxidation. We're going to use protein to remove harsh tannins to the extent that we haven't been successful in avoiding them getting into the wine. Then we're going to pull them out by their affinity for protein finding agents, and we're going to have to take special care to minimize the hit that the aroma and color may take by doing extensive finding trials with a number of finding agents. Then we're going to control sulfides with copper treatments, and then in order to prevent spoilage organisms from forming in the bottle, we're going to sterile filter our wine so that we can assure that it fulfills our goal, which is to lock in clean varietal fruit suspended in development so the wine will preserve itself for a good long while. By contrast, non-ideal solution behavior involves the presence of macromolecular structure in the wines. So here I'm talking about those tannin color colloids that form, and they're going to be apolar, and they're going to have phenolic rings in them. And so there's an affinity for compounds that have phenolic rings that will want to intercalate inside the structure of these colloids. So we're talking about pyrazines and volatile phenols, oak compounds like guaiacol and vanillin and eugenol that will be pulled down into the structure of the wine. And when that happens, that's going to reduce the amount of those compounds that are available to volatilize. And so the solution will no longer obey Henry's law. What does that mean for wine? Well, the properties of a well-structured wine include these. Refined textures, so we don't have a harsh wine, we have fine colloids that support the flavors rather than masking them. We're going to have fruit-centered aromas as opposed to fruit-forward aromas. I'm not talking about raisin wine here. I'm talking about wines where the varietal fruit is in the center of the aroma and it's supported by all of these aromatically integrated phenols and pyrazines and so forth that are taking a back seat but in support to add richness and complexity to the aroma Similar to a great symphony orchestra where perhaps the violins are carrying the melody, but then we have the timpani in the background and the French horn supporting that melody. And so we end up with the whole orchestra, which might have 100 people in it, all playing with a single voice integrated together by a great conductor. If we have a proper structure, it won't precipitate, and these characteristics will persist into the decades. That's what I call graceful longevity. And if we have a microbial equilibrium, it will evolve over time into soulful bottle bouquet. So this kind of stands the implications for winemaking on its head. So, for example, we are not managing aromatics by controlling composition. We're doing it by controlling the structure. We're not farming for flavors. We are farming for building blocks, unpolymerized anthocyanins, cofactors, monomeric tannin precursors. And in later sections, I'll explain how all of that works. We're going to extract the maximum color and tannins and build them into a dense, refined structure. We're not going to try to selectively extract. We now know if we have the skill to take the tannins and build them into this dense, refined structure, then we want all the tannin we can get. So we're no longer concerned with trying to be gentle and get a selective extraction. We want guts, feathers, and everything, because we know how to put that together into a refined architecture. It turns out that the copigmentation colloids that we want to build are more stable at low alcohol. And so we try to avoid overripeness, and we'll even water our musts if necessary to keep the alcohol low. The way we're going to prevent oxidation is by maximizing the wine's reductive strength and antioxidative power. This is also how we're going to control acetobacter and other aerobic spoilage, is by giving that wine the maximum amount of oxygen appetite. We're going to use oxygen to eliminate the need for protein fining. I love this quote from Randall Graham: "I will fear no tannin." He says that's his mantra. We don't like to use copper because it's an oxidizing agent, and we can eliminate it by using enological oxygen properly to balance the reductive vigor. So we actually will take the sulfides and incorporate them into the structure. It's kind of wonderful how that works. So we'll end up not using copper if we could possibly help it. And then rather than sterile filtering, we're going to encourage a beneficial microbiome in the cellar that will outcompete Brettanomyces and encourage the development of soulful bouquet in the bottle. Our goal here is not to make a clean wine frozen in its development, but rather a wine that's set up to have a natural development of aromatic greatness through a balanced microbiome in the bottle. The take-home message here is that the deviation from ideal solution behavior is actually a good working definition of quality. Ain't that a kick in the pants? Coming up next, aging gracefully.